Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic, let's do it. Where's the scariest place you've ever traveled to? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe.
Reconstructed subway which exploded years ago in Daegu, Korea. They memorialized the explosion on site, scorched walls, melted people's items, burned phone booths and all. But the scariest was the scorched walls with the writings and handprints of the people that were trapped during the explosion. The subway is one of the busiest stations even today, due to being the city's downtown area. The old graveyard in Olegre in the Hérault, France. I was camping in the neighborhood, and we visited the village Old and Beautiful. We were young and inquisitive and climbed the wall around an old graveyard. What we found were 19th century graves, often in little grave houses, but grave robbers had yanked the lead coffins out of the houses, and everywhere were opened coffins with skeletons. It was actually very sad to behold. There were 5 of us, and without a warning, we all ran to the wall and jumped back to the world of the living. We all had a feeling we should not stay there for a second longer. We couldn't explain it, just an overwhelming feeling of terror. About 15 years later, I passed that cemetery on the back of a motorcycle and just looked through a crack in the wall. I was struck with that same feeling. It is not a good place. An Airbnb in Barcelona. I've spent quite a while in Spain, speak Spanish, and have visited Barcelona multiple times. I've also used Airbnb multiple times and know what to check for. 2 friends and I, all 20s, female, picked an Airbnb with several favorable ratings in a good neighborhood. One of the ones is a room in someone's apartment. Show up, and the 2 guys look nothing like the picture, but are very hospitable, so we went inside. They showed us around, and the apartment looked like the photos. Then they showed us the room and let us be. We opened the door to the room, and it's nothing like the photos. It's essentially a closet. 3 dirty twin mattresses on the floor, with no pillows and blankets covered in old food. Furthermore, the door to the room has no interior lock on it, but it did have an exterior lock. It's at this point that we also realized they never gave us a key to the apartment. We took pictures of everything and waited until we heard them leave the apartment, then watched them from the window until they were out of sight. We gathered our packs and sprinted out of there, with no plans on where to go. Just calling random hostels until we found one that had a room. But it was on the other side of the city, and the metro had closed for the night, so we walked an hour and a half. Thankfully, the hostel was lovely, and Airbnb refunded us and removed the listing, but we're convinced it was a human trafficking setup. A small gas station on the outskirts of El Paso. It was winter. I was 19 or 20. I remember people had mentioned random violence in the area, but I needed gas in my car. I stopped at a station to fill up. It's cold, so I wore my jacket. As I fill up, 3 guys start walking my way. I saw them from my peripheral and kept a watch on them, but didn't make it obvious. They approached the car, one standing on the opposite side and the other 2 each going on a separate side. I stopped pumping fuel and casually said, "What's up?" To which they asked if they could have some cash for food. I told them I didn't have any cash on me. I remember one of them saying, "I said," in an aggressive tone, and they started coming closer. I stepped back, unzipped my jacket, and stuck my hand on my side, inside the jacket, and said, "I don't know what you want, but I don't have it, and this isn't going to be worth it." They looked at each other, and there was a palpable tenseness in the air, but they eventually went across the street and left. To this day, I'm convinced by the entire thing and how it felt I was close to being jumped and/or carjacked. I'm glad they thought I was armed, because I didn't have shit inside my jacket but a pack of cigarettes and a Sears Tower Zippo lighter. I've been to Mexico a couple of times for business trips. The majority of the time it's awesome, but I've been in some dangerous situations. We usually have someone who worked for us waiting at the airport to transport us anywhere for the weekend, since I didn't speak much Spanish and didn't know my way. It was late at night, and we just left one of our resorts. After maybe 20 minutes of driving, I was told to hide my face by the driver. It felt like something from a movie. All he told me was not to show I was American. I'm pretty sure cartel camps out near where we went and wait to find someone American since they're most valuable. To this day, I have no idea if he was effing with me, but it was one of the scariest moments ever. I had a shop ceramic studio in a hospital morgue from the 1920s. It was rented out as anything goes space, but you're not officially a proper tenant kind of thing. There were dark underground halls with low-hanging pipes to all sorts of crazy, busted-down rooms. Also a dank mustiness that wouldn't go away. It was haunted upstairs and that ghost teams would investigate all the time. However, some funny stuff happened while you were alone in the space or basement, i.e., if you disturbed things like long-shut access panels, they would reopen on their own. If you stayed at a certain hour around 2 to 4 a.m., you would get a sense of dread. Oh, and the property manager would absolutely refuse to set foot in the basement of the place. Another screwy thing that was scary from a lack of maintenance, I flicked the elevator switch for the overhead fan, and it caught fire while it was moving. The place could literally be a death trap, aside from the pile of lead and black mold in our space. My experience was more about the circumstances than the place. I went to a university that offered volunteer opportunities that included cheap international trips. I was on a trip with 20 other clueless Midwestern teens traveling to a school in the mountains of Bolivia. The road was a sheer cliff face on one side and a step drop off the other. And of course, there were crosses along the roadside marking where vehicles had gone over the side. This was just nerve-wracking until the driver stopped the bus for what we thought was just taking a break. Then he scooted under the front wheels of the bus, came out, rooted around in a box, and found a wire coat hanger, scooted back under the bus with the coat hanger, and came out without it. Then, vamonos. Our nervousness turns to concern. At the next stop, a woman gets on as we're leaving and drapes her arm over the driver's shoulder, and they proceed to semi-make out while he's driving. Several of us were white-knuckled at this point. When it gets dark, the driver and his girl light up, and we smell weed. So now we've got a stoned driver getting a hand job in a bus held together by a coat hanger, cruising around these hairpin turns in the dark. Good thing it was a Christian college, and we knew all the words to "Nearer, my God, to Thee." A trucker's motel in Sumatra. After university, I decided to get to know myself better and traveled Southeast Asia for nearly a year on my own. I was on a low budget, so I mostly hitchhiked around and had a few adventures here and there. I felt pretty unstoppable near the end of my trip, although I was wondering what I would be really afraid of. Hitchhiking north in Sumatra, I got into a truck with a kind of typical strong big trucker dude. He didn't speak much English, but seemed friendly. At last, we had come to the end of the road. I was planning to ferry to Malaysia from there, and through sign language, I asked the guy if he knew a place to sleep. He nodded, and ended up taking me to some local restaurant where he offered me food. There were a few locals, small guys there, and all seemed to know the trucker. The thing was that most of these local dudes in the restaurant were clearly gay. They were chatting with the trucker, laughing and looking at me in certain funny ways. At this point, I started to worry a bit about where I might be ending up. Instead of taking me to some sort of hostel, the trucker took me to one of the dirtiest rundown motel places I'd been in my entire trip. I did see a few crappy places before. I really don't want to know what happens there usually. There's kind of a living room. He takes me to the back, where there's another smaller room, and I see only one double bed. From there, there's a door that leads to a washing room, and he signs for me to go wash myself. I tell him I'm fine, and I'll just go straight to bed, but he insists. Now, I'm just so run down with fear of what the rest of the night will bring, I'm starting to make up all kinds of stories in my head. After quickly washing myself, I get into bed, expecting that the guy would be joining me at any point, and thinking how I'd react when he might try to make a move. That moment never came, and when I woke up, I found that guy sleeping on the stone floor in the other room. I felt a bit embarrassed and didn't want to wake him, so I tried sneaking out. Of course, the outside door made a sound when I tried to close it, and the guy woke up and came to me. I could see the disappointment in his eyes that I tried sneaking away. I'm still pretty ashamed of how I disgraced his hospitality in that way.
I mean, a trip like that sounds really cool, but also very dangerous for obvious reasons. I'm glad it turned out all right, because the setup for that was a recipe for disaster. But good people do exist. Good job.
Nasau Bahamas portside. It's an effing shithole to begin with, but my family and I were there on their Labor Day. They had a parade, everyone was having a good time until a dude with a big-ass flatbed truck with massive speakers on it decided to get out of the party a little while the parade had stopped. He forgot to set the parking brake and the truck rolled down a hill, killing 3 people. Cops came, and the locals started getting rowdy. There was an energy that was brewing that's very hard to describe in words. My wife and 2 kids got out of Dodge. The most scared I've felt was standing in the dark at a camp in the middle of nowhere in northern Botswana. The path was between the tent and the reception dining area, and all there was separating this path and the camp from the wilderness was a flimsy fence. There were no lamps. I had stopped to admire the stars that blanketed the sky. Then I lowered my gaze to stare out at the inky blackness beyond. It was so dark, I could not even see my hand. The thought that ran through my head was that a lion or a leopard could be watching me that very moment. Could be mere meters away, and I would never know until it's too late. I stood there for a few minutes, savoring this fear, reminding myself that this was what it was like for humans only a few hundred years ago, and thousands before that. Humbling experience. Statistically, the most dangerous place I've been to is a shantytown township informal settlement in Cape Town. Informal areas like these are among the most dangerous areas in South Africa, but funnily enough, I didn't feel unsafe as I was there for only a couple of hours in daylight, and the people around me were friendly. Not much compared to the stories here, but I think I almost got trafficked at a train station in Stamford, Connecticut. The station I was at gave me a very uneasy feeling to begin with, because I'm a woman and I was traveling alone, and it was late at night. But I was waiting and minding my business when a woman approached me and said that she needed to call her husband with my phone. I said no, and she just kept persistently asking, almost yelling at me. I sternly told her no, because my train was coming, still had another 20 minutes or so. And once she saw an officer coming out of an elevator close by, she bolted down the stairs and away from the waiting room. I didn't see her again after that. Maybe I was wrong, but my gut told me that she was going to take my phone and run somewhere with it so that I would follow her. The market at night near my grandparents' house in India. For context, I am Indian American, so I visit India pretty often. One time my grandparents needed something from the market, so they asked my mom to go. Typically, women don't go by themselves at night because, sadly, it is really common for a woman to be barred. So my mom asked me to come with her too. That is scary as there were only about 3 street lamps. Mind you, this was in a pretty big city in India, so that's kind of uncommon. The market itself was the whole street, and we had to go deeper into the market to get to the store we needed. There wasn't a single woman or kid, only grown men, staring at us while they had a drink or cigarette. The staring at us, and the entire time I was only thinking about what my mother and I would do in case any of them attacked. We got to the store we needed and got the thing, but the storekeeper looked at us really weird, as if he was surveying us. Even after we left the store, I could still see him looking at us. I wanted to go back to my grandparents' house as fast as possible, but my mother was wearing a sari. She doesn't wear that in that shit in America, just in India, and it's impossible to run in that, at least the way my mom was wearing it. It was super hard. Eventually, after we passed a group of men sitting on a motorcycle, we saw them all get up and start following us. At this point, my mom also started to panic, and we both practically ran, more like speed walking, but my mom was going as fast as I was, and we got on the main road where there were far more people and a lot more light. The man stopped and went back on the motorcycle. I honestly can't tell you how scary that was. The fact that I could have possibly been murdered and my mom possibly R'd because she was the murderer. There was no mistake. These men were coming after us. And ever since then, neither me, my mom, nor anyone from my family went to that market at night. When I was 14, my family went up north to this town called Gaines in Pennsylvania. If you're from the area, you know the main town is lovely, but the outskirts can be quite questionable. My grandfather was from the outskirts, and I swear the whole trip was just creepy. On the way up, our GPS made us take this dirt road off of the highway. Once we were going down the road for about 10 minutes, we found ourselves in front of the old farmhouse that looked as if it were straight out of a horror movie, with a field next to it that only had one cow in it. The cow looked as if it hadn't been groomed in a long while, and it visibly had an impacted tooth, tumor-like swelling in the face, and everything just looked run down. We eventually got back to the highway and made it, and we still talk about the road every Halloween. That was only the beginning of the trip. My grandfather's house was weary, we could say patched up. The original building in itself was built in the 1890s as a brothel, if I remember properly, but since then my grandfather has added on a porch and a new kitchen, as much of the original building was unstable and he had to seal it off. The structure was actually quite comparable to the movie Monster House. The house was always off-putting, and we weren't helped by the fact that we were freezing since this was around late November and we were in the mountains of northern Pennsylvania, also New York. We slept in the guest bedrooms on the second floor and constantly heard footsteps in the third floor hallways, and we adjusted by the time we left, but the first night was restless. If I ever go back to Gaines, I can tell you I'm not staying in that house. That house aside, the neighborhood itself was actually creepier. Almost every truck we saw driving around was missing a license plate. There was a trailer park at the end of my grandfather's street, and 2 of the probably 30 trailers were selling guns out of them. All of the people in the neighborhood were reminiscent of characters from The Hills Have Eyes, and as a very sheltered and geeky 14-year-old, I was terrified and intrigued at the same time. After talking to my grandfather for a little bit about the interesting characters of the neighborhood, my mom thankfully told me to stop taking walks around the neighborhood, as there were several registered S offenders against children my age in the area in unmarked cars. I spent the rest of the trip inside the house for the most part, adjusted to the footsteps and the creepy energy, as well as the smell of sulfur in the water. On the third night of our stay, things somehow managed to get creepier. On the third night, and every night after our 8-day stay, there was a rolling blackout. This rolling blackout was different than what you'd imagine though. At midnight on the dot, the dogs in the whole neighborhood would start barking. The street, and until the power went out in our house, the TV would remain static. As a disclaimer, I was not mentally sound prior to or during this trip, and there were many family scandals going on at the time, so my perception may have been skewed, but that neighborhood was the scariest place on earth the way I saw it.